Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the MindGym's webinar on More Than Money, how to increase productivity without spending a penny, a cent, or whatever currency you work with. My name is Octavius Black. I'm the CEO of MindGym, and I'm delighted to welcome you today. This story starts for me, I think, when I was asked by a global bank to run a session with the chief operating officers from across the world, to gather them together for the first time to talk about how to build a high-performance culture. Before the session, I thought it would be wise to speak to them each individually and ask them a simple question: what do you think motivates people to perform better? When I got to speak to the most senior, the COO of COOs, if you like, I asked him a question, and he simply said one word: money. Aha, I said, I understand. What do you think about things like coaching and feedback? Oh, that, he said, that's just collateral damage. Well, whilst this must have been the most absolute of views, of the hundreds of senior leaders I've asked over many years, what do you think will motivate people to perform better? Money is invariably in one of the top three. Which made us think, what if it doesn't actually affect performance? What if there are other things that are far more effective? What if it is a myth that you can pay for performance on the scale of perhaps the emperor's new clothes, that we're actually costing businesses billions because we're maintaining something that isn't borne out by the facts? MindGym is founded on 6 beliefs. Science is sexy, and in research we trust is one of them. And so we went to look for the data. Now, coming up this fall is a new study from Wharton, which claims to make unequivocal the fact that, and I'll quote, high pay not only fails to promote better performance, but can harm productivity. It goes on to say, there is no evidence that massive financial incentives attract the best talent. Well, we'll have to wait a few months before we see the robustness of that data. But fortunately, there's plenty that we can look at before then. So after this brief introduction about what this webinar covers, I'm going to look at and share with you some of the data on financial incentives. What does the evidence suggest? Then to ask a question why, however strong the evidence might be that money doesn't work, we'll still want to believe that it does. And indeed, it's in business leaders' self-interest to fight tooth and nail to lay on to the hold of this claim. Then we thought, what if we turn the question on ourselves? What if the question about what are the 3 things that are most likely to improve productivity was asked of MindGym? What would we say and why? And we'll share those answers with you. And finally, the multi-billion-dollar question: what impact does this have on the bottom line? And before we start, though, I want to ask you a question. And you'll have a chat box to your right, and I would ask you to think about the following question. People often say, what would you like to be better? I wish I could work less and earn more. But what about if you turn the question the other way around? Who chooses to work more and get paid less? This is a group of full-time workers that wherever you conduct the research in the world, you find, actually to be fair, in the Western developed world, they work longer hours, they are more positive about their work-life balance, and yet they earn less than their colleagues. Which group of full-time workers do you think this might be? Please tap away with your suggestions. And if you would like a clue, there is a clue. Indeed, as many of you are suggesting, the answer to this, well, I should say some of the things it's not nurses, it's not parents, it's not stay-at-home parents, though I accept that is full-time and they certainly get paid less, but they weren't included in the study, so that's a good suggestion. It's not retail staff, and it's not authors or writers. It is, as some of you have suggested, self-employed people. It's certainly not politicians that someone's just promoted. The interesting thing here is that people who work for themselves consistently earn less, work harder, and by all measures are more productive. They're certainly happier, and they're certainly happier with their work-life balance. So if this is a large sample that suggests that more money doesn't get people to work harder, in fact, it seems to be the opposite. You have to pay a premium to get people to work in an organization, to be employed. that's one set of data, but perhaps, rightly so, it doesn't prove anything. So let me, secondly, share a study. This study looked at what was the impact of life-changing bonuses on tasks to do. And it got people into 3 groups, randomly selected, and gave them the same tasks to do. But it changed the bonus they got for doing them. So for each task, there was one group that got the equivalent of a day's money if they got the task right. The second group got the equivalent of 2 weeks' money if they completed the task successfully. And the third group got the equivalent of 5 months' pay, really life-changing money if they got the task completed. These are cognitive tasks of memory puzzles and those sorts of things. Now, you'd like to think this is quite a highly sponsored experiment if it was run in the United States or in Europe. It was actually run in India initially, though it has been repeated in the US at smaller scales and delivered the same results. What I'm going to show you now is the graph for the percentage of people who were great performers. Great was the top performance category, i.e. they were the most successful at completing this task. And what we can see is that those who, I hope, those who, I'm having a little, those who, there we are, I'm sorry, excuse my technical incompetence. Those who earn 1 day's pay and those who earn 2 weeks' pay much the same amount, achieve much the same amount. So in effect, you were paying 9 days' pay and you weren't getting any more productivity for that, but you weren't doing any harm. Then came the issue of the 5 months' pay. Now, one would expect if money was likely to lead to an improvement in performance, these would be statistically way ahead. Well, there's certainly a statistical difference, but actually they're statistically way behind. Now, perhaps you could argue, well, this is the great performers. What about the good performers, leveled below? Perhaps they were overrepresented amongst the 5 months' pay. But the chart is statistically the same for the good performers as well as the great performers. So we have the story of the self-employed. We have this significant study run both in India and in the United States that shows that larger bonuses lead to worse performance. But hang on a moment, that's just an experiment. That's in a lab. Maybe it's different at work. So let's continue and look at a study done by Boris Kreuzberg. Now, what he did was he looked at analysts who work for banks. There's a famous line about analysts. When an analyst moves from one bank to another, the only thing that changes is the letterhead at the top of the paper, or the signature at the bottom of the email. Now, this is because their skills are so transferable. They do research, they do writing, they're good at networking, but actually where they work shouldn't matter too much. Now, there's pretty much only one reason why a team of analysts goes from one bank to another, and that is to earn more money. So you'd think if they got any more money, they would then be performing better. But in fact, what Boris Kreuzberg discovered was they did a lot worse. The key measure of an analyst's skill and capability, like output, is their position in the all-important rankings. And the chances of falling off these rankings was double, 32% if they moved versus 16% if they stayed. Now, there are other studies of this nature and more that are to come that again suggest that at the very least, paying people more does not lead to increased productivity. And it's quite possible, as these studies imply, that actually paying people more leads to worse performance, less work from those employed, less hours worked from those employed and self-employed, less performance of the cognitive tasks, worse results from the analysts that moved. Now, business is supposed to be a rational activity, and leaders are supposed to look at the facts and use those in order to increase the productivity and profitability of their organizations, even more so in times of austerity where the cupboard is bare. So why is it that as more and more data becomes clear to suggest that money isn't the key factor, business leaders still seem very inclined to focus on it as the primary lever, that they still believe you can pay for performance? Well, there is an answer to that, and we believe the answer is quite clear, and it comes from a recent study from the University of Michigan. You may have seen research before that implies that after a certain level of annual income, $20,000 to $25,000, people's happiness does not increase as they get wealthier. Well, this is the largest study done so far, and the graph and data is pretty clear. In whichever country you are, as average household income increases, your level of self-reported satisfaction also increases. And so whether it's cause or correlation, we could be forgiven for imagining that the wealthier we are, the happier we are. And of course, if we work for somebody else and we want to get wealthier in order to get happier, how can we make that argument? Well, we'd have to maintain that you pay for performance. And if you want to get more out of me, you'll have to pay me more. So this is a very self-serving myth for those people who run and lead organizations, but it's certainly no evidence to suggest it's in the organizations or the shareholders' best interests. So if money isn't the answer, if there are other things that matter more, what might those be? Now, mind you, we've asked ourselves that question and we come up with 3 suggestions. These aren't for sure guaranteed to give you the biggest return. There may be other things in your organization, in your context, that will do more. But we believe, looking at the data, they're 3 of the most reliable. That if you do these, you will almost certainly get an uplift in performance. And critically, none of them need cost you a penny. So what are the 3? The first of these is about giving people a sense of purpose. The idea that what they do matters, that it contributes to something more than the outcome or the output itself. Now, an interesting study was done on people's relationship with work. They were asked, large numbers of people in lots of different professions, in lots of different countries, were asked to allocate 100 points across 3 categories for how they think about work. Did they see it as a job, something you turn up to, you get the money, and you use that to pay for the extension or put the food on the table or your children's shoes or whatever it may be? Or was it a career? Was it something that you did in order to progress and advance up a ladder to greater respect, to greater seniority, and so forth? Or was it a calling? Was it something you did in order to deliver an outcome that was more than the contribution that you made and that mattered more than whatever personal gain you got from it? And people were asked to allocate 100 points across these. Now, in one part of the experiment, doctors were asked this question, and so were the cleaners or janitors in the hospitals where they worked. Now, one might imagine that the doctors, hopefully, had more of a calling. Or maybe you might imagine the janitors did. You think that would be wonderful. They really could see the impact that they had. What was interesting was that for both the hospital janitors and the doctors, and indeed for pretty much every other category of people, the split was statistically the same. And it was this: a third, a third, a third. So how we look at work depends not on what we do, but on how we perceive it. And we have as much chance of seeing something as a calling as in an admin function or a call center as we do as the professional or the person who is deemed to be making more impact. Deemed by whom? I'm not always entirely sure. So this is interesting, and for psychologists, you go, oh, that's a good bit of research, but does it matter? Well, here's the interesting finding. What they found was that there was no difference between those who did sort as job or career in terms of life satisfaction, job satisfaction, or the need for more work-life balance. But for those who saw it as a calling, those who chose to look at their work in that way, they were not only more satisfied with their job and with their life, but they felt less need to alter their work-life balance. They were more committed in many ways to the way that their life is. And therefore that suggests that if we could get the people in our organizations to shift across that line from more on job and career to a little bit more on calling, we have a distinct advantage to gain from that. Now, I'm going to be clear what a purpose looks like. I was running a session on happiness in Canary Wharf, which is the financial district in London, which up until a few years ago was the only part of London without a place of worship. It's a little digression point, but it gives a sense of this very financially driven culture. And in this group was someone who worked in the accounts department at this large bank. And she said, how can I see what I do as purpose in any way? And so we talked about how the financial system works and how important trust is, and it has always been, in order to move beyond the world of barter. And that when we lose that trust, as we've seen recently, things can wobble quite badly. And that trust is built on people like her acting with integrity and producing figures and data that we can rely on. And so she started to see that her role was actually about protecting the Western banking, financial, and free market system from complete collapse and going back to a primitive age of barter. Now, that might be a little extreme, but it gave her a sense of being rather different than just completing spreadsheets and submitting them. On the other side of the world, I was working in Mumbai recently with a group of people from a fast-moving consumer goods company. And one of the ladies in the group was in charge of personal care products for Pakistan. And she said, you know, Octavius, I've got a real problem at the moment because I've got a very clear target, which is to double growth from rates previously. But I feel really bad about it because Pakistan is a really tough country to be in. And, you know, anything can happen during the day. You leave in the morning, you come home at night, and you don't know what will have happened. And the news is always pretty terrible. And here am I just selling these peripheral products. And I said, okay, why do you think you can double growth in this country? Oh, she said that people in Pakistan care disproportionately about their personal grooming. It's well known that Pakistanis give a lot of attention to how they look, men as well as women, but women even more so. So I said, well, then why do they buy your products? And she said, well, it gives them a sense of confidence. It perks them up for a little bit. It makes them feel a little more good about themselves and a little more able to go out into the world with a smile on their face. So I said, in effect, you're giving moments of joy to people who are otherwise having a pretty tough life. She said, I suppose you could describe it like that. And in that conversation, we started to think, not a definite answer, not a firm conclusion, but to think about how the purpose of what she did is actually a great social contribution rather than just about growth margins and so forth. So when we talk about purpose, what we are not talking about is having a line on a laminated card that everyone can pull out and say, here's the purpose. If you like, what we're talking about is getting people to feel they belong to the same religion rather than singing from the same hymn sheet. And so this is, as we will come to in the others as well, about conversations that enable people to choose to think and look about their work differently. So the first thing I wanted to suggest to improve performance is purpose. The second one is even more practical. It's about setting goals that stretch but don't strain. The first study I want to share with you about is from the American Pulpwood Association, who looked at the performance of Canadian loggers. Now, you may not know this, and I certainly didn't, but by and large, loggers turn up for work, they get up their saw, they chop up trees, they put their saw away, and they go home again with a little break from a drink from the thermos flask and the sandwiches in the middle. So what the study tried to do was it split the group into two. One was the control group that carried on doing that. But with the others, it introduced a way of measuring how many trees they chopped and set them goals each day for how successful they would be. And what they found that those who had the goals and had the measures massively outperformed those in the control group. So the simple act of setting goals and measuring performance against them got them to be more competitive, more driven, they seemed to enjoy their work more, and they certainly cut an awful lot more trees. They then did a second study where they looked at the difference between those who, or they had originally had a group which just simply loaded the trucks. And they would load the trucks and then they'd bang it on the side and say, off you go. But when they show what the maximum load was and started measuring people about how well they had filled the truck and therefore what percentage of the maximum load they achieved, you can see there's a massive increase in performance from around the 60% to around the early 90s. It didn't happen immediately, it took a lot of time, it wasn't completely linear, but nonetheless, you're starting to see a big shift. Now, you might say that's fine for loggers, but we don't employ loggers. We have a very different group of people in our organization, and really not sure it will work for them. Well, some of you may have heard of the study from Yale Business School. It's often reported in books, including, I'm embarrassed to say, one of ours, where it claims that those graduates who wrote down their goals actually perform better in life. Some say they earned 18 times more, sometimes they say they were 29 times more likely to achieve their goals, simply by writing them down when they graduated. Now, we've searched far and wide, and so have a few others, and no one can find this study. It appears as one of those myths that doesn't actually exist. Luckily, someone else has done a similar study to test it out. And here is what they found. This is Dr. Gail Matthews from Dominican University, who took a group of working people and split them into 5 groups. The first group simply said, this is my goal. I want to complete this project. I want to have achieved this within a certain period of time in my working environment. The second group actually wrote down what they wanted to achieve. The third group wrote it down and wrote the actions that they would take. The fourth group wrote it down, wrote down the actions, and made a commitment to a friend. And the fifth did all of those and provided progress reports on how they were doing. So, and as you can see from the results, the data is pretty clear. You're seeing a statistically significant shift upwards. It's not perfect, it's not linear. Why did the group with written actions not do as well as the group without them? We don't know. Maybe the sample wasn't large enough. But again, the pattern, the general direction, is pretty clear. Now, this gives us a good start. But actually, what is interesting is to see what impact does this actually have in business. We've got loggers, we've got people in an experimental study. But here's a study from a guy called Jack Fitz-Enns, who's one of the experts in human resource management. And what he looked at was the difference between strong-performing companies and weak-performing companies. And if you look at the second bar here, you will see an enormous difference between those organizations where every manager has goals aligned to the company strategy and those that don't. In fact, they are 40 times more likely to exist in a strong financially performing company than a weak financially performing one. So that, in summary, is our evidence for setting stretching goals. And we can talk, and there's more work from Edwin Locke on the difference between a goal that stretches versus one that strains. So what is number 3? Number 3 is appreciation. I'd like to share with you now an experiment done by Professor Dan Ariely. He ran it such that each person would walk into the room, the subject would come in, and they were asked to sit down and build a Lego figure. In fact, the very Lego figure that you're seeing on the screen in front of you. For the first one, they were paid $3. For the second, $2.80. For the third, $2.60, and so on. In group 1, the Lego figures were taken from them and displayed on the desk, and then they were given a new set of pieces, and they would assemble that, and then their new Lego figure would be placed on the desk, and they would carry on for this until they decided to stop, as they were earning less money each time. At some stage, they were likely to say, this is no longer worth my while, thank you. In group 2, the pieces were taken from them, and then the figure was disassembled in front of them. They were given a separate bag with new Lego pieces to rebuild, whilst the piece that they had created was taken apart in front of them. And then when they created the new one, the old pieces had now been taken apart, were given back to them, and then the new Lego figure was taken from them and disassembled again. So in effect, there were 2 sets of Lego pieces. One they were either building, and the other one that was being disassembled, ready for the next build. Now, in the first group, the people on average completed 10.6 figures. They earned $14.40 in total, and that was an average of the cost of producing them was $1.36 per figure. Now, we're now going to set up a quick poll to ask you how many figures you think Group 2 completed. And the poll has started, and it's the same, minus 10%, minus 20%, minus 30%, or even less than that. And please click on the option that you think is the likely one. And we're just setting that up now. And I'm loving your drift. We are all very much in the same ballpark here, with different degrees of views on quite how much that impact is. The largest, most successful selection is fewer than 7.2. The actual figure, because we like to give actual figures, is 7.2 itself, minus 30%. But as we can see, the vast majority of us are not surprised by the result. And here's what the data actually comes out with. That the average cost per figure went up from £1.36 to £1.60. So that's a 15% increase in the cost per item produced, simply by people not thinking that their work was, or the increase in the cost went up because people thought their work was completely pointless. It's not in the first case it had great meaning. It wasn't they were building a Lego city, or you had enormous praise about the beautiful way the Lego figure had been created. It was simply that the fact that their work did not seem meaningless was enough to get you a 15% increase in the cost, productivity improvement in the cost per unit produced. Now, this is an experiment, and it's done in a study, and it's a social science piece, and there are those in business who will say, quite frankly, that's in the lab, I don't get that. There are others who will hopefully listen and be impressed by it. So for those who haven't, we looked at another study, which looked at people at work, and the difference between performance reviews that were based on strengths and how well you were doing and how you could do even better, and those that were based on weaknesses, what you weren't doing, the gaps in your skills, what you needed to change. And here we can see a very clear statistical difference between those formal reviews that were based on strengths versus those formal reviews that emphasized weakness. The study was then continued to look at what happens with informal reviews. And here, the difference was even more marked. Those informal reviews that focused on strengths, those pieces of appreciation and recognition and praise, led to the greatest improvement in performance. Those informal conversations about you shouldn't do that, you got that wrong, actually were the least likely to have any difference in performance. But interestingly enough, in this study, this still led to an improvement in performance. So here we are. We have research that suggests that money or incentives can actually lead to worse performance rather than better performance. We have a very good reason why people would choose not to believe that. And we have here offered three, not the only three by any means, but three non-financial ways that the research would suggest we can improve performance. But the multi-billion-dollar question is, what impact does this have on the bottom line? And luckily, some people have done this work for us. Gallup conducted an enormous survey. If you look at the bottom, you'll see the size of this: 49,928 business units in 34 countries, covering 1.4 million employees. That is a decent sample size. And these are the results that they found. Now, some of these may be relevant, some of them will apply to certain industries. But to suggest that our business, our organization, is so different from the rest of these, that this wouldn't infect us, takes a level of chutzpah that even the COOs that I was working with at that bank found eventually hard to swallow. He finally admitted, when we shared the research, step after step, dismissing each study as it came, he finally said, it has to be said, we can't be that different from the rest of the world. But this is just data. This is studies, this is surveys. They're big data. But what about actual stock performance? Well, fortunately, there is a fund which looks at stocks and invests in those that are increasingly likely to focus versus their peers and invest more on people. It's called Bassi Investments, and they've written a book about this. And of their 9 main funds, 8 have outperformed the S&P 500. The one that hasn't, they claim, is because the criteria were too narrow. But again, you can see here a clear path and a pattern. But maybe they are, I don't know, exaggerating the impact. Maybe they're not using the criteria as clearly and using other criteria as well. So let's not just look at Bassi Investments, who've got a workplace fund, but there's also Parnassus Investments. Now, they too have a workplace fund on similar criteria, where they believe that they can identify those organizations that invest most in their people versus their peers, and that they invest in those businesses. Now, again, looking at their fund, what we see is actually the difference up until 2008 wasn't necessarily so massive. But since then, since the financial crisis, since the cupboard is bare, we're seeing an enormous and very significant difference between how they're performing and how both the S&P 500 and the upper large cap are performing. Now, there is an argument one could make, and we're always listening to skeptics and always ready to hear the challenge and eager to hear it in many ways, that this applies to the West more than it does to the East. But then we have the lovely story of HCL Technologies. And here's their CEO, Vinit Nair, who's written the book, Employees First. His whole approach is that if you put employees first, you'll get better results than if you put customers first. Because when employees care and when they're committed, when they have goals, when they're appreciated, when they're part of something that has a sense of purpose, you will get better results. And his business has done that. And you can see the figures on the left. So we hope that in this little time together, we've managed to share with you some of the findings that we find interesting, that challenge the myth that you can pay for performance. But let's help explain why that's going to be such a difficult myth to bust. And that also to give us some practical things that we can do. So that when we hear people say that money talks, we actually know it's not the money that talks, it's the talk or the good conversations about, for example, purpose, goals, and appreciation, and many other things besides that lead to improvement in money. Thank you very much for your time taking part in this webinar. It's been great to share this opportunity with you. This will be available for all who would like to listen to it again or to share it with colleagues on our website. And you can follow us at themindgym.com, and I'm available at Octavius Black. Thank you once again. Goodbye, and wishing you well wherever you are in the world.